I had the great pleasure of doing some kind of keynote in December at Charleston for their anniversary of secession, flanked by the wonderful historians Emory Thomas and Bud Robertson. Those of you who know Bud Robertson, who is now at least 80 or 81, was actually the executive secretary of the Civil War Centennial. It was a transcendent moment to follow Bud, who was explaining the Centennial, as I was trying to be a historian of it. That's the first time that's ever happened to me, to be a living participant in something. Most of us in this field stay in the 19th century, but it's uncomfortable when we get into the 20th. And then about, 4 weeks ago, I was speaker at the kickoff of the Connecticut sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And I can assure you they did it. A huge reenactor gathering. If anybody's nervous or uneasy about having reenactors around, they do it everywhere. Don't feel bad. And they had cannon firings. I mean, Connecticut. What is it, the state of nutmeg and good values? Steady habits. Steady habits. Good values. Where did I get that? God. We got governors in jail and everything, like every other state, you know. It's, anyway. There's a lot you don't know about John David Smith, so I'm going to get him back one time here. Spies in the bluegrass state. Actually, John is not only one of my favorite people, but one of my favorite historians. When I finished Race and Reunion, I don't know, 10 years ago, because John is the best historiographer and bibliographer among other talents in this business, I hired him for $200 and a bottle of bourbon to read my footnotes to find the errors. 90 pages of footnotes or something. He found all kinds of errors, and he still claims I never paid up the bottle of bourbon.
That's true, or the cash.
No, I gave you the cash. I still think I gave you the bourbon, but I don't know. It's in a blurred memory somewhere, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I know why.
Yeah. John mentioned that he has the galley of my new book. That's the first time I've seen it. They don't send it to the author. They send it to I don't know. It's the first time I've seen the thing. So, and the book really is inspired mostly by Robert Penn Warren. I'd always wanted to write something on Red Warren, and he led me to several other writers. While Robert Penn Warren was writing his wonderful little short book, essay, if you like, called The Legacy of the Civil War, a little Bible, if you want, of the Civil War Centennial moment, he first wrote it for Life magazine as a kind of meditation essay. And he got a letter one day from his editor at Life, Jeffrey Korn. And this was in 1960 when Warren was writing it. Korn says, "Now, Red, here's what you got to do. You got to explain to the American people this appeal of the Civil War. What is its attraction? Why don't we ever," this is 1960, "why don't we ever get over this, Red? What is the appeal?" And Red Warren writes back in a private letter and he says, "Well, I suppose it's because we think that war made us so great. We're like the dog staring at the icebox. We just can't stop looking at it." Is that what we do with our Civil War? Why do we love this event? How many of us, don't raise your hands, how many of us in this room have used that line before? Or how many of us who are historians encounter people all the time, or students all the time, who come up to us and say, "I just love the Civil War." And you want to say, what do you love about the slaughter of 625,000 people? What is it that we love about this event? Love's a complicated thing. Do we as a people gaze at our Civil War more than we actually understand it sometimes? Is this most pivotal event in our history still at its 150th anniversary now? A story we are sometimes like rubberneckers at a horrible car accident. Are we fascinated by all that blood? Or have we indeed by this time, by this anniversary, finally matured to a stage of reasonable national consensus on the war's causes or consequences? Or is there an unbridgeable distance between historical scholarship, the things we write, and that vast, vast, limitless public memory when it comes to this most divisive and mythic event in our story? Depending on who you ask and when you ask those questions, of course, there are varieties of yes and varieties of no to those kinds of questions. It's also Robert Penn Warren, and so many quotable lines from that little book, who said, "The Civil War draws us as an oracle, darkly unwritten and portentous, of national as well as personal fate." An oracle. If a nation can have a historical oracle to go back to, and that's a complicated concept, but if the Civil War is our oracle, if we believe our own rhetoric that this is the pivotal turning point of our history, it's certainly of the 19th century, then where is that oracle? What is that oracle? Is it on Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg? Is that where we find the oracle? The so-called high watermark of the Confederacy, at least that's one definition of Cemetery Ridge. It took me a long time, many, many visits to Gettysburg, to realize, wait a second, high watermark of the Confederacy, but the Union won here. Why isn't there some Union definition for Cemetery Ridge? I got it after a while. Is our oracle on Monument Avenue in Richmond, whichever way is north of here? Is that where we would go to find the oracle? Is it in the words on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial? Our national secular temple? Is that where we go to find the oracle? Maybe. Every conceivable kind of group in our history has used that place since 1922 as our great national space. If we have a national cathedral, that's it. I know we have a national cathedral in another part of Washington. Is it at Stone Mountain in Georgia? A massive great Confederate memorial? Or is it St. Gaudens? Masterpiece, bas-relief, the Shaw Memorial in Boston. That great transcendent rendering of the 54th Massachusetts and its commander, Robert Gould Shaw. Possibly the greatest work of art, at least, about our Civil War. Is that where you go, we go, I go to find our oracle? Or is it in a book for some of us? Some passage, a favorite moment, a favorite piece of prose, maybe by Bruce Catton, or Shelby Foote, or a few lines of Walt Whitman, or oratory by Martin Luther King Jr., or an essay by James Baldwin. You might all have your favorites. Some paragraph somewhere, like scripture, that we go back to when we really need to somehow understand, so what was that Civil War really about? Or is the oracle of our Civil War simply in our minds, ready to burst into action when prompted by some modern political issue, or fear, or a legacy that suddenly hits us between the eyes when we're not looking, when we think history's over and we're reminded again it's never over, and the legacies are living things? Was the oracle of the Civil War and the tears flowing down people's faces on the night that Barack Obama was elected president? Was the oracle in the tears of the eyes of those people who have been resisting him, believing he is somehow representative of the ruin of their history? What indeed holds our imagination to our worst national nightmare and bloodletting? Why do we care about this event? There's so many answers to this. So many answers. I'm only going to suggest why the Civil War has this hold on us. 5 or 6 are on my list today, and this list could go on, and you could all make your own list, and we could have a wonderful seminar, especially if we were to read 3 or 4 things. One, I mean, are we always drawn back to this event to begin with because of its sheer scale of loss? Is it loss, not just defeat? Certainly in the South, the burden of this story, of course, whether one reads it in Faulkner or in Warren or anywhere else, it isn't just defeat, it's loss. 625,000 roughly soldiers who die of battlefield wounds and disease, uncounted numbers of civilians, thousands of African-American freedmen in contraband camps, and we now have scholars really carefully studying those contraband camps and even trying to study the phenomenon of civilian casualties in the Civil War. We'll never have any kind of accurate number of civilian casualties, but there probably were more than we've ever realized or even wanted to look at. Is it essentially loss that brings us back to this event? Many of you know this statistic probably and use it in your own lectures. If we take that 625,000 dead in our Civil War, projected ahead per capita to the Vietnam War and the Vietnam era, we would have lost approximately 4 million in Vietnam. Imagine 4 million names on the Vietnam Memorial. The space it would take per capita. Or as Whitman put it in that transcendent line in Specimen Days, the dead, the dead, the dead, our dead, or south or north, ours all, the dead. And then of course Whitman transforms that, as Whitman would, into his hopeful, at least imagined, redemption. He said somehow in the dead that had unmade America, maybe we could remake it. Is it the dead that draws us back to this story? Probably, at times. It should. Maybe at the 75 or so national cemeteries, and you have some of them in North Carolina. One of my favorites is in Salisbury. Such a peaceful, little isolated cemetery. Secondly, is it indeed, for so many people still, without a question, the fascination with military history? Why not? It's important. Some of us in the academy who grew up with the social history revolution, the cultural history revolution, maybe cut our teeth by, in some ways, ignoring military history or denigrating it perhaps at times, thinking it was just guns and ammo or troop movements, and campaigns and battles and leaders, and so on and so on. I was always a closet military historian, fascinated with it, a buff, I confess. In a moment I'll confess more. Bruce Catton was my reason, my way into this field when I was about 15 or 16. Are we drawn to this because it was a great contest? Great contest that makes and unmakes governments and peoples and nations, and in the end destroys as well as it perhaps creates. Is it war itself that fascinates us sometimes? Should we admit that? Go back and read almost anything by Ambrose Bierce if you want to get to the depth of the macabre in that fascination. If you look up Bierce's definition of war in his famous Devil's Dictionary, it's a long definition. It's brilliant and funny and satirical and horrible, as most of Bierce's writings. But in it he says, in time of peace, prepare for war, has a deeper meaning than is commonly discerned. It means not merely that all things earthly have an end, that change is the immutable and eternal law, but that the soil of peace is thickly sown with the seeds of war and singularly suited to their germination and growth. Every time history seems to settle down, war comes back. Or as Bierce put it, war loves to come like a thief in the night. Professions of eternal amity provide the night. Or thirdly, are we really now, particularly as scholars, and I think in perhaps public memory too in less specific ways, are we drawn back to the Civil War because we really are always looking for a sense of our modern origins, whatever modernity is, and I'm not going to even try a definition, but are we searching for the origins of our own modernity? Is it a central event at which we can somehow see an earlier America vanishing and a more modern one, a newer one, evolving? And there we can point to industrialization if we want. We can point to all sorts of things. But here, fourth, I think deeply related to the third, is that we are now drawn back to this event. However we've come to it through schooling, through family, which is still probably the deepest single root of interest in the past, much less in this event. And from the last at least 40 years of scholarship, our lifetime, we've come to see this event essentially as the death of the first American Republic and the birth of a second. And man, that's important. If a nation wants to understand itself, it ought to understand that turning point. What died in the Civil War? 625,000 soldiers, thousands of civilians and freed slaves. But the first republic, invented in the late 18th century, died there too. That's exactly the argument of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and his famous use of the rebirth metaphor. It's exactly the argument of one of Frederick Douglass's greatest wartime speeches that he called the mission of the war. The argument was that that first republic was being destroyed. That's what Lincoln's saying at Gettysburg. It's being buried in those graves in front of him in that cemetery, as horrible as it seems. And some kind of new second republic has to be born. He didn't have it figured out. He mouthed the word equality. The Second Republic was indeed born in the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. We live today in the land of the 14th Amendment. How many Americans could even tell you what Section 1 or Clause 1 of the 14th Amendment is? I was recently at a meeting with the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. They're doing a big Civil War exhibition. And out of that day-long meeting, I was just throwing around ideas for the hell of it. And I suggested what we really need in this country is like 20,000 14th Amendment local clubs. Imagine how boring that would be. But I thought that the Constitution Center would be the place to start this. They would form me again. They have no money. They can barely put on the exhibition. They're laying people off like all other public history institutions. But I wanted 20,000 14th Amendment clubs so that people would be out there learning about the Equal Protection Clause and birthright citizenship. Without the emancipation of 4 million slaves, we would not have birthright citizenship. We would not have the Equal Protection Clause. 2/3 of all litigation in a case law book is 14th Amendment litigation. And we still in this society don't even know what that amendment means, as we learned last year when a certain political persuasion in our society decided that birthright citizenship ought to be repealed. There was a Civil War legacy that hit us between the eyes, whether we knew it was coming or not, or whether we even knew what it meant. Or fifth, of course related to the last one, we're drawn back to the Civil War for the obvious reason that it was our first great racial reckoning, a precursor to other very big ones to come. But if indeed race, our struggle for diversity, our deeply American struggle with multi-ethnicity, our deeply American story of the whole and the many parts, the eternal American story of the whole and the parts, where else to go for a good start and a great lesson about this one than the Civil War? Emancipation is in some ways the pivot of the 19th century. While I'm up here generalizing. And in a couple years, we're going to have the 150th anniversary of emancipation. and I look forward to that equally as much as secession. Maybe more. And last but not least, and I have not exhausted any of this, have I? Of course. But last but not least, are we drawn to the Civil War, let's admit it, because it is simply a great story? Are we drawn to it because we're drawn to epic? Great stories with beginnings, middles, ends, resolutions that we choose, that we fashion, the resolutions we want to live with, the memories we want to create, heroes and villains. It's a great story. No one knew that any better than Ken Burns. Ken's a great filmmaker, a thoroughgoing romantic, and a lover of epic. And his favorite Civil War book ever was Robert Penn Warren's Legacy of the Civil War. I was just on a panel with Ken Burns at the New York Times auditorium, I don't know, a month ago, and I happened to have this little book with me, and Ken saw it. He said, "Oh, can I read from it? Can I quote from it?" So we walked out on the stage, and he grabs the book. He says, "I think it's page 83. There it was. He read this passage by Robert Penn Warren. The audience was transfixed. And after he read it, I said, "Ken, what did that mean?" Anyway, but listen. A quick aside. Story. Let's admit it. It's a great story. And we've had some great storytellers. Some of them are in this room. I confessed earlier that my path into this business was Bruce Catton. I had no relative or ancestor in the Civil War that I know of. My parents never gave me any history books to read. I didn't have an uncle who said, "Here, boy, read about this." I had great teachers. But somewhere in my teenage years, I started reading the great Bruce Catton. All right, confession. How many of you grew up reading Bruce Catton of a certain age or vintage? Fantastic. I did this in Charleston last December, and Bruce Catton was the keynote speaker at the Citadel, where I was speaking, in December 1960. And I asked for shows of hands, and it was similar. At the end of it, though, two somewhat older men got up and said, "I was a cadet at the Citadel in 1960. I met Bruce Catton. I heard that speech." Yeah, you quote from it, but I heard it. Another one of those moments when you think you should stay out of the 20th century. I just want to read a couple passages by Bruce Catton, just briefly, because this has something to do with why we're drawn to this event. And there are plenty of other events that beautiful narrative can be written about, plenty of other events that fit the genre or the definition of epic. There are many favorite moments. This could be my oracle, I suppose, to go to in Catton. Catton wrote 15 books, as some of you may know, between 1951 and the early 1970s. He's an extraordinary writer, given very little credit because he's kind of discarded by scholars as that popular historian who got wealthy writing books. We love to resent those people. He was born right outside Benzonia, Michigan, a tiny little one railroad stop town in northern Michigan, the Lower Peninsula, about 300 miles northwest of Detroit, the cut-over lumber district, as he called it. He wrote a great memoir that is still in print and you should read, called Waiting for the Morning Train. The title comes from the idea that as a kid, there was nothing else to do in Benzonia except sit down at the train station and talk to the old Civil War veterans, the GAR guys. And that's what he did as a kid, year after year after year. Until he was about 16, he said, he loved Memorial Day. He loved to get out there and march with the GAR guys to the cemetery. They had this makeshift monument. Town couldn't afford to buy one of those, foundry-made monuments, so they made their own. He said he loved it until he was about 15 or 16, and he began to think, maybe I'm too fascinated with all this. Of course, he wasn't. He dropped out of Oberlin College in his sophomore year to join the U.S. Navy in World War I. He's on that wonderful list of college dropout writers. If you're a student, don't do that. It's not a good thing. After the war, became a journalist for 20-some years all over the North with major newspapers, went to work in the government in World War II as a high-level bureaucrat in the War Production Board. He wrote his first book, The Warlords of Washington, in 1948, which is still a brilliant history of the federal government's links to private enterprise in World War II, the mobilization story of World War II. It's an amazing book, actually. I'd never read it until recently. And then he quit his job and started hanging out at the Library of Congress reading diaries and letters of old soldiers. And in 1951 wrote Mr. Lincoln's Army. And in 1953 wrote Glory Road. In 1954, Stillness at Appomattox, which won the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, and hundreds of thousands of readers. He became the meal ticket of Doubleday Publishing. And book after book after book after book, including children's books, including the great picture history of the Civil War put out by American Heritage, which I bet many of you still have. Mm-hmm. And then at the Centennial in 61, 63, and 65, producing them just like the new models of Chevys, right on the dot. He wrote The Coming Fury, Terrible Swift Sword, and Never Call Retreat, and on and on. No one ever had more readers about this event than Catton, and here's why. This is his brief ending of Glory Road. Glory Road is the story of the Gettysburg Campaign, and then up into the fall to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It's a typical Catton ending. It goes like this. He's describing the scene at Gettysburg Cemetery, November. Lincoln comes to Gettysburg to give the address. There were many thousands of people at this ceremony, and among them were certain wounded veterans who had come back to see all of this. And a knot of these wandered away from the crowd at the speaker's stand and strolled down along Cemetery Ridge, pausing when they reached a little clump of trees, and there they looked off toward the west and talked quietly about what they had seen and done there. In front of them was the wide, gentle valley of the shadow of death, brimming now in the autumn light. And the voice went on, and the governors looked dignified, and the veterans by the trees looked about them and saw again the fury and the smoke and the killing. He's, of course, describing their hearing Edward Everett's 2-hour address, which they weren't listening to. This was the valley of the dry bones, Catton goes on, waiting for the word, which might or might not come in rhythmic prose. The bones had laid there in the sun and the rain, and now they were carefully arranged state by state under the new sod. They were the bones of men who had exulted in their youth, and some of them had been unstained heroes, while others had been scamps who pillaged and robbed and ran away when they could, and they had died here. Back of these men were innumerable long, dusty roads reaching to the main streets of 1,000 youthful towns and villages, where there had been bright flags overhead and people on the board sidewalks cheering and crying and waving a last goodbye. Perhaps there was a meaning to all of it somewhere. Perhaps everything that the nation was and meant to be had come to a focus. Here, beyond the graves, perhaps the whole of it somehow was greater than the sum of its tragic parts. And perhaps here, on this windswept hill, the thing could be said at last, so that the dry bones of the country's dreams could take on flesh. That orator finished, and after the applause had died away, the tall man in the black frock coat got to his feet with 2 little sheets of paper in his hand, and he looked out over the valley, and he began to speak. And that's how the book ends. In Catton's papers, there are thousands of fan letters. The most amazing fan letters. I mean, I've never worked in Elvis's papers or Bob Dylan's papers or Springsteen's papers or whatever. But there's thousands of fan letters. And he got a lot of letters about this ending. For some people, they were disappointed. They wanted him to quote the Gettysburg Address. Why did you stop, Bruce? And then others said, oh, it's the most beautiful ending. I can't wait for your next book. I read it slowly because I don't want it to end, and on and on. But that's how Catton would write. Of course, anticipating the next book, knew what he was doing. One other little example. In Terrible Swift Sword, a book he publishes in 1963, that's mostly the Antietam campaign. And it's the Catton touch, if ever there was, his secret, if you want. I don't know any other writer who would have the audacity to sort of employ the language of the Battle Hymn of the Republic in his own prose. By then, he was a confident writer. He's trying to describe the turning point of that campaign, turning point in the whole war, which of course has so much to do with emancipation. And there's this little paragraph. There was nobility, says Catton, in the idea that there ought to be a peace without a victory. Yet in August 1862, America's terrible tragedy was that it was caught between the madness of going on with the madness of going on with the war and the human impossibility of stopping it. Neither Mr. Lincoln nor Mr. Davis was going to assume anything of the kind. Each man was fighting for a dreadful simplicity. Neither one could describe a solution acceptable to him without describing something wholly unacceptable to the other. Neither man could accept anything less than complete victory without admitting complete defeat. That's an authentic definition of tragedy, if you want one, by the way, parenthetically. And Catton concludes, both sides had heard the trumpet that could never call retreat. The peacemakers could not be heard until the terrible swift sword had been sheathed, but the scabbard had been thrown away, and now the Confederacy was carrying the war into the enemy's country. Maybe that's the only explanation we need for why we're drawn to the Civil War. Just read some Bruce Catton. All right, so much for my confessions. But while I'm on Catton, the title of this lecture has Civil War memory divided us or united us? Well, obviously the answers to that question, as you all would know, have everything to do with when we ask it, about whom, and how we ask it. It depends on who or what is dominant at any given time in history over this story. It has everything to do, as all questions of historical memory do, and there's some great scholars of memory in this audience, Fitz-Brundage among others. It has everything to do with who is controlling that story. Bruce Catton wrote a little essay in 1965 that I think is indicative of a way of, or it helps us get a handle on understanding this question of when and how and why Civil War memory has divided us or united us. And I suggest this is one other reason why we're so drawn to this event, because so often we still do it every day in every way, and there's a way in which we almost have to. We have made this most divisive, this bloodiest, most terrible event in our history into a unifier. We have insisted that it unify us. Why not? Who's against that? At the end of the Centennial, Catton wrote a little essay called The End of the Centennial. It was almost like he was taking a deep breath, like, thank God it's over. Somebody here is going to write that in 4 years. And in it, he discusses memory very forthrightly. I remember when I first read this, I thought, oh, Bruce, all right, memory. I was feeling justified in studying memory. He marveled in the piece at how Americans had healed, which was his word, from their civil war, that a nation could actually commemorate a civil war so openly at all, he thought was amazing. That a modern country could go back and commemorate its civil war and get through it somehow, especially at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, he thought was marvelous. The war, he said, was, quote, a source of unity. And I quote him, "The memory of our Civil War has not been a divisive force in this country." Do I need to repeat that? It's not been a divisive? And when I first read that, I had that moment of thinking, oh, Bruce, say it ain't so. You didn't really say that. And the first time I ever read this piece was right after I'd finished Race and Reunion. I'd just written this 500-page book arguing precisely the opposite of what my hero just wrote. Don't get too close to your heroes. For forging all the unity, he gave much of the credit, in that little essay anyway, to Grant and Lee in the nature of the surrender at Appomattox. You know, the leniency, the compassion of Appomattox. But primarily, Catton gave credit to what he called the Confederate legend, which he described as, quote, a mighty, omnipresent force in the land. In all seriousness, Catton declared, quote, the legend of the lost cause has been an asset to the entire country. That's 1965. I remember being hopelessly disappointed when I read this. He portrayed the lost cause as a benign, innocent, romantic set of legends, driven by the assumption, he said, and I quote, that no hint of enmity should ever be kept alive. Now the problem there, of course, was that Bruce Catton had never done any research on the lost cause. Catton did not understand in 1965. It wasn't his beat. He did not understand in 1965 just how much, he should have, but he didn't, just how much the lost cause tradition had really been a racial ideology. That scholarship in many ways hadn't been written yet, although Bruce should have still somehow understood that. His lost cause was the South's story of noble sacrifice and heroism, of a nostalgic older civilization as a kind of bulwark against modernism. And in the end, he said, again, Catton's words, this is the Yankee historian of the Army of the Potomac, and the largest selling author about the event. He said, in the end, it is what saved us. Now, at the very end of that little essay, Catton did acknowledge, and remember, it's 1965, this is 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, peak of the rights phase of the Civil Rights Revolution. He said, nevertheless, we must remember that the unfinished business of that Civil War was what he called Negro equality as its, quote, deepest legacy. And then he ends by saying, and the Negro was what the war was about somehow. Now, knowing Catton, that somehow was probably a riff on Lincoln's use of somehow in the third paragraph of the second inaugural, where Lincoln says, all knew slavery. The war was about slavery, somehow. And for a while, I couldn't forgive Catton for this essay. I mean, to me, I was ready to, burn my dilapidated old paperbacks. No, not quite. But then I began to realize he was summing up mainstream understanding of the lost cause in 1965. The power, the dominance over the national memory, the collective national memory of the lost cause was such that Catton just believed it. Lost cause belonged to everybody. Hadn't really been a racial ideology. It wasn't really about white supremacy. Has it divided us? Has it unified us? Well, I want to end by just bringing us to the present as best I can. You don't even hardly have to have your eyes open or your ears available these days to know that the legacies of the Civil War roiling all around us, probably most pertinent or visible or loud in our now, once again, every time we think it goes away, it doesn't, our national debate over federalism. over the relationship of state to federal power, over states' rights. Yes, the Civil War was about states' rights. A lot of you in this room, just like me, have had umpteen phone calls from reporters in the press these past 2 or 3 months. Often the question comes right up front. Was it really about states' rights? Because here in my hometown, that's what they say. Yes, ma'am, it was about states' rights, but you always have to ask, I say, states' rights for what? Well, there are websites following this now. There's been a lot of press coverage. As you surely know, out in American state legislatures in particular, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of bills, not many of which have passed yet. Some have, but not many of which have passed, that are aggressive exercises of states' rights against federal power all over the country, and surely not merely in the South. The state of Kentucky wants to make that state, as a bill, hasn't been passed yet, what they call a sanctuary from the Environmental Protection Agency. In Arizona, there's a bill that wants to exempt all products made within its borders from federal interstate commerce laws. There's lots of these around state legislatures now. These are state legislatures obviously now controlled by the Republican Party. Montana has a load of these things. They have a Democratic governor, but they have a Republican legislature. Montana, among other things, is considering a bill that would, quote, unquote, nullify federal laws that protect endangered species. Actually, Utah has this one too. Several western states have this one. And in fact, my favorite one in Montana is that the Republican-controlled legislature has a bill that would require the FBI to get local sheriff's permission to ever make an arrest. Forget Bull Connor. Forget our history with local, never mind. Forget our history. Just get rid of the FBI. Get rid of federal enforcement. Georgia has a bill that would require banks to accept payment in gold and silver, overriding the federal monetary regulation. And on it goes. Utah has a bill that actually passed in 2010 that would allow the state to simply seize federal land. Just take it back. Just take it. And on that list goes. Certain state governors, Governor Perry in Texas, others, have used at least the language, the rhetoric of secession and nullification. The word nullification has appeared particularly in the debate, of course, over the health care law. And I've lost count now how many states have passed bills or have bills pending to resist the federal health care law, which have voted it down, which have voted it up. I've actually stopped following that. But just to focus on it for a second. These are some loose comparisons, but it's just for our sake to think about. And some of these groups, of course, that support, who are vehement supporters of states' rights today, call themselves 10th Amendment people, or tenthers, as they're sometimes called. This is part of what libertarianism has been about for years and now is ascendant. Think with me for just a second about a comparison we might make between secession in 1861 and our new nullifiers, or our new states' rights advocates of today, whether they're members of the Tea Party or some other group. Both, it seems to me, are distinct minorities of the whole of the American population. But nevertheless, of course, history shows us that distinct, powerful, vocal minorities can really change the history of the nation. Secession was obviously a minority of the American people, and possibly even minorities within certain states that even seceded. That is, in vehement support of it. And I'll leave that to you to figure out exactly who supported it in North Carolina or who didn't. Secondly, one acted in revolution, 1861, for a slaveholders' republic. And one is acting to alter or abolish at least a century-old, maybe a century and a half old notion of a social contract between people and their government, the beginnings of which we surely can see in the Civil War. If big government in this country has an origin, It's in the Lincoln administration, the first Republican Party. Both, 1861, 2011, claim their mantle of righteousness, if you like, in the name of liberty. Everybody claims liberty in America. They claim their mantle in the name of liberty, states' rights, individualism, privatization, and to a degree, today almost entirely unspoken, in 1861, not unspoken, of racism. Both, 1861 and 2011, make a vehement claim to the authority and reputation of the Founding Fathers, the Founders, as though the American Revolution, and especially the U.S. Constitution, are some kind of monument in stone, rather than a story made and remade over and over by real people in real history. Both embrace a version of federalism we have some right to believe was buried in the mass slaughter and the bloody soil of the Civil War. But alas, of course, it isn't. History keeps happening over and over. I'd love to end with a piece about James Baldwin, but in the sake of time, I want to go back to Penn Warren again. If you've read his little book, Legacy of the Civil War, you may remember this little ending. It was Robert Penn Warren's vision, it was James Baldwin's vision, it was Edmund Wilson's vision, and it was Bruce Catton's vision in his own way, that what Americans could not, would not entirely ever wrap themselves around is that the Civil War was our authentic tragedy. Authentic, genuine tragedy, a fated tragedy. Not a catastrophe like another car accident. And at the end of his book, Warren, since he was such a Melvillian, he absolutely loved Herman Melville. He loved Melville's Civil War poetry. He chose to quote Melville. He sets it up this way, though. This is Warren. The word tragedy, he said, is often used loosely by Americans. Here we use it in its deepest significance, the image and action of the deepest questions of man's fate and man's attitude toward his fate. For the Civil War is massively that. It is the story of a crime of monstrous inhumanity into which almost innocently men stumbled, of consequences which could not be trammeled up, and of men who entangled themselves more and more vindictively and desperately until the powers of reason were twisted and their very virtues perverted, of a climax drenched with blood but with nobility, somehow gleaming ironically and redeemingly through the murk, of a conclusion in which, for the participants at least, there is a reconciliation by human recognition. And then he quotes from Melville's Battle Pieces, or the supplement to Melville's Battle Pieces, where Melville said in 1866, "Let us pray that the terrible historic tragedy of our time may not have been enacted without instructing our whole beloved country through pity and terror." And then Warren says in 1961, have we been instructed by that catharsis of pity and terror? And then he says, sadly, we must answer no. Our task with the sesquicentennial by 2015 is to hopefully be able to say yes, that we have finally, maybe, explained this event to ourselves. Thank you.